It was the summer of 1977 when Peggy Hodgson, a widowed mother of 4, Janet, Margaret, Johnny, and Billy, moved her family into 284 Green Street, a modest council house in Enfield, North London. From the moment they crossed the threshold, there was something off. The air inside felt heavier than it should, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something or someone to arrive. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they ought to, and faint whispers echoed through empty hallways, too soft to understand but loud enough to unsettle. That first night, as the family settled into their new home, strange banging noises reverberated through the walls. At first, Peggy thought it might be neighbors or settling pipes, but the sounds grew louder and more deliberate, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Then came the scratching sounds, faint yet persistent, like claws dragging across wood, emanating from the corners of rooms and beneath floorboards. Peggy tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from moving into a new home. "It's just an old house," she told herself firmly. But deep down, a gnawing unease lingered, a primal instinct warning her that this place wasn't entirely theirs. It watched them. It waited. 2 months passed before the first signs of trouble appeared. At first, it was subtle. Doors slamming shut on their own, furniture shifting inches at a time without explanation. Then came the whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs echoing through empty hallways late at night. Margaret swore she heard her name being called from empty rooms, though no one was there. Johnny claimed his toys rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking. Even young Billy refused to sleep alone, insisting that a man stood at the foot of his bed every night. One evening, while tucking Billy into bed, Peggy heard a loud thud coming from upstairs. Thinking one of the older kids had dropped something, she called out but received no response. When she went to investigate, she found nothing amiss. Yet, as she turned to leave the room, a chair scraped across the floor behind her without anyone touching it. Moments later, a series of sharp bangs erupted from the wall beside her, so forceful they rattled the pictures hanging nearby. "Who's there?" Peggy demanded, her voice trembling. Silence answered her, save for the faint sound of laughter, childlike yet cruel, drifting from somewhere unseen. Behind her, the scratching sounds resumed, louder now, as if whatever lurked within the walls was growing bolder. From that moment on, the disturbances grew louder, stranger, and far more sinister. The chaos soon drew the attention of neighbors, who began hearing strange noises emanating from the Hodgson home. Concerned, they called the police multiple times. Officers arrived at various points during the haunting, initially skeptical but soon confronted with evidence they couldn't ignore. One particularly memorable night involved PC Ken Stonelake, who responded to a disturbance call. As he entered the house, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring against him. When he stepped into Janet's bedroom, he saw furniture sliding across the floor on its own. A chair tipped over just inches from where he stood. Then came the banging noises, loud, thunderous booms that shook the entire house. PC Stonelake followed the sound to the living room, only to find the source impossible to pinpoint. The walls themselves seemed alive, pulsing with each impact. Another officer reported hearing disembodied voices whispering threats directly to him while standing in the hallway. One voice hissed, "Leave now or you'll regret it." But perhaps most unsettling were the scratching sounds. Low, rasping noises that seemed to emanate from the baseboards and ceilings. They were constant, relentless, as if some unseen creature was clawing its way closer. Though reluctant to admit it publicly, several officers privately acknowledged that something unnatural was occurring within the walls of 284 Green Street. By September, the poltergeist activity reached its peak. One evening, Janet sat frozen in the middle of her bedroom, surrounded by chaos. Furniture violently floated in midair, dark shadows writhed around the room, and strange symbols glowed faintly on the walls. Janet's face contorted in terror, her eyes wide, as a dark, misty figure loomed over her. She screamed until her voice went hoarse, collapsing onto the floor as the objects crashed back down. The cacophony of sounds was overwhelming. Loud bangs reverberated through the walls, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of scratching, as if talons were raking across the wooden floor. Peggy rushed into the room, only to hear a guttural growl emanate from the darkness. The glowing symbols pulsed with malevolent energy, casting an eerie light that made everyone's skin crawl. They resembled ancient runes, twisting and writhing like living things, spelling out words none could decipher. Witnesses described the scene as otherworldly. It was as though the room itself had become a battleground between dimensions, with Janet caught in the crossfire. One fateful evening, Janet stood in front of her bedroom mirror, brushing her hair. Suddenly, the reflection staring back at her was not her own. It was a twisted, grotesque version of her face, grinning menacingly. The glass distorted and dark. Shadowy tendrils reached out from the mirror as if trying to pull her in. Before Janet could scream, the mirror cracked violently without any physical contact. Shards exploded outward, narrowly missing her face. As the shards levitated around her, a deafening crack echoed through the room, followed by a low, guttural laugh that seemed to emanate from the broken glass itself. Behind her, the scratching sounds grew louder, almost frantic, as if whatever force inhabited the mirror was enraged. Peggy burst into the room just in time to see Janet collapse to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably amidst the wreckage. "It's trying to hurt me," Janet wailed. "It hates me." Investigators were baffled. How could a mirror shatter spontaneously? And why did the shards behave so unnaturally? Some suggested poltergeist activity often manifests through objects tied to personal identity, like mirrors, but no explanation fully accounted for the sheer strangeness of the phenomenon. In addition to flying objects and eerie whispers, fire became another weapon in the entity's arsenal. On multiple occasions, small fires erupted spontaneously throughout the house. Once, flames licked up from a pile of newspapers in the living room despite there being no source of ignition nearby. Another time, curtains burst into flame in Margaret's bedroom, forcing the family to evacuate temporarily. What made these incidents especially sinister was their timing. The fires always seemed to occur when tensions were highest, as if the spirit fed off fear and panic. Investigators theorized that the entity might have been using pyrokinesis, a rare psychic ability associated with extreme emotional states, to torment the Hodgsons further. Firefighters responded to several calls, though they too struggled to explain how the blazes started. Each time, the damage was minimal enough to prevent total destruction, leaving the impression that the fires were meant to frighten rather than destroy. Amidst the chaos, the banging noises intensified, shaking the house to its foundation. Peggy described the sound as like someone hammering on the walls from the inside. Meanwhile, the scratching sounds persisted, growing louder and more aggressive, as if the entity was taunting them. As the haunting intensified, Janet became the primary target of the entity's wrath. During one terrifying episode, neighbors witnessed an impossible sight. Janet levitated several feet off her bed, suspended in midair as though held by invisible hands. Her face contorted in terror. She screamed until her voice went hoarse. When she finally fell back onto the mattress, she collapsed into unconsciousness. On another occasion, Janet stood in the center of a room, her body contorted at impossible angles, her eyes glowing white. The room around her was in chaos, with furniture thrown to the sides, as a dark, spectral figure hovered behind her. Witnesses described her as possessed, her movements jerky and unnatural, her voice guttural and menacing. In this state, Janet spoke in tongues, uttering phrases in languages no one present recognized. Throughout these episodes, the banging noises continued unabated, accompanied by the incessant scratching sounds. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to the turmoil unfolding within its walls. Desperate for answers, Peggy invited a local priest to perform an exorcism. The ritual began quietly enough, with prayers and blessings filling the air. But as the priest invoked divine protection, chaos erupted. Furniture overturned, windows shattered. A deafening roar filled the house, shaking its very foundation. The banging noises reached a fever pitch, echoing through every corner of the house. Investigators chanted in Latin as the room filled with swirling black mist and violent energy. Lightning flashed, and objects crashed to the ground. For a brief moment, hope flickered in the hearts of the Hodgsons. But the respite was short-lived. Within hours, the disturbances resumed, fiercer than ever. Behind the chaos, the scratching sounds returned, louder and more frantic than before, as if the entity was mocking their efforts to banish it. Perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of the haunting was the recurring presence of the man in the attic. This spectral figure reportedly haunted the upper floors of the house, appearing to both children and adults alike. Described as an elderly man with sunken eyes and a gaunt face, he bore a striking resemblance to Bill Wilkins, the deceased former resident whose name had surfaced during seances. Late one night, Peggy climbed the stairs cautiously after hearing footsteps creaking above her head. At the top, she froze. Standing in the dim light of the attic doorway was the shadowy silhouette of a man. His hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Without uttering a word, he vanished into thin air. Moments later, the scratching sounds resumed, emanating from the walls of the attic. Peggy backed away slowly, her heart pounding, as the banging noises grew louder, shaking the fragile structure around her. Strange, glowing symbols appeared in midair, swirling around an unlit room. The symbols pulsed with energy, casting an eerie light on the faces of the people in the room, who were visibly disturbed by the supernatural force at work. In the final confrontation, the room was bathed in dark, stormy light, with violent winds tearing through the house. At the center of the chaos, a priest stood tall, holding a cross, facing off against a dark, spectral entity that towered over him. The entity was surrounded by flickering shadows and a thick, menacing fog that seemed to pulse with energy. Despite their efforts, the entity remained defiant, refusing to be banished. Throughout the confrontation, the banging noises and scratching sounds reached a crescendo, drowning out all other noise. It was as if the house itself was screaming in agony. By December 1977, the Hodgson's ordeal reached a crescendo. During one of their final sessions with investigators, Janet entered a trance-like state again. This time, however, the voice speaking through her sounded different, calmer yet infinitely colder. "You cannot escape us," it intoned. "We are bound to this place. Leave now or suffer forever." As the chilling message echoed through the room, the banging noises stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, it seemed as though the entity had finally relented. But then, faint scratching sounds began again, softer this time, almost teasing, as if to remind them that the haunting was far from over. Realizing they had no choice, Peggy made arrangements to relocate her family. They moved out quietly, leaving behind a lifetime of possessions tainted by fear. Though relieved to be free of the haunting, The Hodgsons carried the trauma of their experience with them for years to come. Though the Hodgsons escaped the nightmare, the legend of the Enfield Poltergeist endured. To this day, 284 Green Street stands as a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that some mysteries may never be solved. Visitors to the house report hearing faint banging noises and scratching sounds late at night, as if the spirits of the past still linger within its walls. And somewhere, in the shadows of that quiet suburban street, the whispers of the past still linger, waiting for the next chapter to unfold.